My daughter asked me to give a speech at her fundraiser. I prepared for days, practiced every line. On the night of the event, she pulled me aside and said, "Actually, let's have my stepdad speak instead. He's more polished for this crowd." I said nothing. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% of our viewers who click on the like button. This really makes us happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. Now let's get into the details of the story. I'd been a lot of things in my life. A systems analyst, a weekend painter, a decent cook when I followed the recipe. But the one title I'd always clung to, even when the world stripped the others away, was dad. I didn't become a father by accident. From the moment my daughter was born, squinting and screaming under those harsh hospital lights, I knew I was all in. When her mother and I split, I told myself the title wouldn't change. Maybe the marriage had dissolved, but my role didn't. I learned how to French braid with YouTube videos. I sat through dance recitals with crusty eyes and early morning coffee. I was there, always there. So when she asked me to give a speech at her upcoming fundraiser, a sleek event she'd been organizing for months with that sharp sense of perfection she inherited from her mother, I said yes before she even finished the sentence. She called it a small but meaningful speaking role, a few minutes during the dinner hour to talk about her early inspirations and why supporting the arts mattered. But to me, it wasn't small. It was everything. I treated it like the Super Bowl. I spent nights pacing the living room, reciting paragraphs like incantations. I rewrote the draft 7 times. I kept looking for that balance, just enough heart to make it real, just enough polish to match the venue. She'd sent me photos of the space, a stunning gallery downtown with high ceilings and abstract installations that looked expensive and aloof. I tried to picture myself there, in a tailored blazer, surrounded by donors and critics, and people who smelled like money. I wasn't intimidated, at least I kept telling myself that. But I wanted to be ready, not just for her, but for me too. This wasn't just about being part of her event. It felt like a signal, proof that even in this new chapter of her life, I still had a seat at her table, that she still saw me, that I mattered. I even bought a new pen just to sign the donation check, something symbolic, something sharp. I told myself it would mean something. She would know how much thought I'd put into all of it, how much I cared. The morning of the fundraiser, I woke up already rehearsing lines in my head. My tie had been picked out days ago. I polished my shoes, trimmed my beard, even spritzed the fancy cologne I saved for job interviews and funerals. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared at myself longer than usual, practicing the way I'd smile at the end of my speech. Warm but not needy. Proud but not smug. I imagined her face in the crowd, lit up by the dim glow of gallery lights, eyes soft with pride. I kept picturing that version of her, the little girl who used to clap wildly when I read her bedtime stories with funny voices. She used to say, "Tell it again, Daddy," even if it was the 3rd time. That's who I was channeling tonight. That version of us. The drive downtown was smooth, too smooth, like the universe had decided not to throw any detours in my way. I parked in the garage below the gallery and clutched the manila envelope with my speech in one hand, the donation check tucked inside like a sealed promise. When I walked in, she was already buzzing around, clipboard in hand, hair done up in soft curls, heels clicking across the polished concrete floor. She looked so grown, so accomplished. My chest swelled watching her take charge. For a second, I just stood there, admiring her from a distance like I was one of the guests. She caught my eye and smiled, walked over with quick steps, and hugged me lightly. "You look nice, Dad," she said. I thanked her, nerves fluttering under my skin. "I'm ready," I told her. "I've got the speech right here." I patted the folder. "Been rehearsing all week." Her smile tightened just a bit, like someone pulling a ribbon too taut. "Actually," she started. What she said next was surgical. Clean. Painless if you weren't listening too hard. "Actually, let's have Rick speak instead. He's more polished for this crowd." That's what she said, like it was just a scheduling tweak, a logistics adjustment. I looked at her for a beat, my brain still catching up to her mouth. Rick? I echoed. She nodded, eyes already darting over my shoulder toward the stage. Yeah, he's just got that presence, you know? More buttoned up. He's great with this kind of room. Her voice was light, transactional, like she was rearranging chairs, not gutting me in real time. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for context or clarity. I didn't demand to know when she'd made this decision or why she didn't tell me sooner. I just reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the check, and tore it clean in half without a word. The rip echoed louder than I expected. Her mouth dropped open, and for a moment, we both just stood there in that awkward silence, the kind that wraps around you like wet clothes. I handed her the two halves. For the arts, I said simply. Then I turned and walked away. There's a very specific kind of silence that follows humiliation, one that hums behind your ears and makes the world feel 10 degrees colder. As I found my seat that night, tucked near the edge of a table with strangers who smiled politely but didn't know my name, I felt like I was watching someone else's life through a pane of glass. The stage up front gleamed beneath the lights, perfectly lit, perfectly dressed. Every detail of the event radiated polish, sophistication, success, except for me. I sat there with my hands folded, the edges of my torn check still ghosting my fingertips. I wondered if anyone noticed. If she noticed. But when I looked up, my daughter was already laughing with someone near the front. Rick stood beside her, his hand on her back like he belonged there, like he was the one who'd carried her through every disappointment and dream. I was just part of the background now. Furniture. The speech began 15 minutes later. Rick stepped up with ease, clearing his throat as if he'd been waiting in the wings his whole life. The crowd leaned in. I didn't hear most of what he said. Something about perseverance, something about mentorship, something about vision and legacy, and all the other buzzwords that make people feel warm enough to open their wallets. He was good, I'll admit that. Smooth, well-rehearsed. Not a stammer or pause in sight. The kind of man who thrived in a room full of catered wine and strategic networking. But the words felt borrowed. There was no grit, no soul, just polish. The applause when he finished filled the room like a fog machine. People stood. I did not. I clapped, politely, but I stayed seated. Because I knew the difference between performance and presence. And for once, I didn't feel like faking it. After the speech, dinner was served. Tiny portions on oversized plates, the kind of meal that looked better on Instagram than in your mouth. I picked at mine while the woman next to me complimented the program. He's such a strong speaker, she said to me casually. They're lucky to have him in her life. I didn't respond. I just nodded like I agreed. Even though my jaw clenched so tight, I thought I might crack a molar. Every now and then, I'd glance at my daughter across the room. She was working the crowd beautifully, like a conductor leading an orchestra of compliments. She didn't look back at me once. And yet, even as I felt the sting of it, I didn't get up. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene. Because that's the kind of father I had always been. Present, but quiet. Supportive, even when it hurt. Eventually, she made her way over, her heels clicking lightly on the floor, a glass of white wine in one hand, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. What was that? She asked under her breath, crouching slightly next to my chair. Her tone was sharp, but controlled. You tore the check in front of everyone. I looked around. Everyone? I asked. Pretty sure no one noticed. They were too busy clapping for Rick. Her lips pressed into a tight line. You embarrassed me. I let out a small, humorless laugh. No, I gave you exactly what you gave me. She blinked, thrown. What does that mean? I met her gaze. You replaced me. Without warning. Without care. You turned me into a placeholder and expected me to smile through it. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just stepped back. Like I always do. She shifted on her heels. It wasn't personal, Dad. Rick he's better with these kinds of people. He knows how to speak their language. I stared at her. And I guess you think I don't. She hesitated for the briefest moment, and that pause told me everything I needed to know. Maybe she didn't mean it to come out cruel. Maybe she didn't realize how deep that knife went. But that was always the thing with her. She never quite saw the blood until you showed her the wound. You asked me to speak, I said quietly. I didn't volunteer. I didn't push. You asked, and I took it seriously. I practiced. I wrote it with my whole heart. That wasn't a performance for me. That was love. Her expression flickered. Guilt, maybe, or irritation. It was hard to tell. You're making this a bigger deal than it is, she muttered. It's one speech. One night. I nodded slowly. Yeah, one night. But it showed me exactly where I stand. She stood there for another second, then straightened up and walked away without another word. I watched her go, her figure folding back into the crowd, smiling again before she'd even reached the next table. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been willing to admit before. This wasn't new. This wasn't about one night. This was a pattern I'd been enabling for years. I had always been the quiet supporter, the background character, the fallback plan. And every time she pushed me aside, I made excuses for her. She's just overwhelmed. She didn't mean it. She'll realize soon enough. But maybe she wouldn't. Maybe this was who she had become, and maybe part of that was on me. The rest of the night blurred past. I stayed long enough to avoid drama, but slipped out before dessert. No goodbyes. No final conversations. I walked back to my car alone, the city buzz rising around me like static. When I sat behind the wheel, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat there, letting the quiet soak in. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like fixing anything. I didn't feel responsible for smoothing over the cracks. I wasn't going to send a follow-up text apologizing for the misunderstanding. I wasn't going to write a new check in the morning. I had given her everything. My time, my trust, my words. And she'd handed the mic to someone else. Let her see how that sounds when the applause fades. The next morning, the silence in my house felt unnatural, thicker than quiet, more like something missing than something peaceful. I brewed my coffee slowly, standing by the window like I always did on weekends, watching the leaves gather in the yard I hadn't raked in weeks. Normally, I'd have a text by now, something from her saying, "Thanks again, Dad. You killed it." Or even a picture from the event with one of those soft captions. Couldn't have done it without this man. Instead, my phone stayed dark. I scrolled anyway, half out of habit, half out of hope, until I saw the post. It was a photo of her and Rick at the podium, faces close, both smiling like they'd just sealed a business deal. The caption read, "Grateful for the man who always shows up." I stared at the screen, thumb hovering above it. There were over 200 likes already. Comments rolled in, friends, co-workers, even some relatives. "He's the best. What a team. She's lucky to have him." And in that moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt erased. I didn't comment. I didn't like it. I didn't send her a message asking what she meant by it. Because deep down, I already knew. That post wasn't just a thank you. It was a performance, a narrative, and I didn't fit into it. It wasn't the first time she'd curated a version of her life that left me out. Over the past few years, there'd been hints, holidays where I wasn't invited until the day before, birthdays where I got the late afternoon slot, while Rick got brunch and cake. I had told myself to be patient. Divorce complicates things, and step-parents aren't villains just because they're new. But there was a difference between making room for someone and handing them your seat. I wasn't just being nudged aside anymore. I was being rewritten, replaced in the story of my own child's life. By midday, a cousin of mine, Sharon, called. We weren't especially close, but she had a reputation for inserting herself into situations just enough to seem helpful, but never enough to be accountable for the damage. "Hey," she started, her voice coated in something syrupy and smug. "I saw the post from last night. Looked like a big night for your daughter." I could hear the setup coming from miles away. "Yep," I replied flatly. "It was." She paused, waiting for me to fill the space, then continued. "I heard you were supposed to speak, but pulled out last minute. Is everything okay?" There it was. The version she'd heard, likely from someone who only saw what my daughter wanted them to see. I didn't correct her. I just said, "Plans changed," and ended the call soon after. What was the point in defending myself to someone who already assumed the worst? But it did get me thinking, how fast narratives travel when you're quiet. When you don't explain yourself, people write the story for you. And maybe that had been my mistake all along, assuming my silence spoke love when, really, it just gave everyone else the pen. I spent years stepping back so she could shine, thinking that's what good fathers do. I celebrated her wins, even when I wasn't invited to the table. I never asked for credit, never demanded recognition. But now I was seeing the result. She believed the story she'd written. That Rick was the one who always showed up. That I was something else. Optional. Replaceable. Fading. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Marcus, an old friend who'd known my daughter since she was a toddler. He'd been at the event too, though we hadn't crossed paths. "Hey man," he said cautiously. "Just wanted to check in. I noticed you didn't speak last night. Everything cool?" With him, I didn't have to perform. I told him what happened, every word of it. The speech, the last-minute switch, the torn check. He didn't interrupt. Just let me talk until I stopped. Then he said, "Damn, that's cold. You handled it better than I would've." I chuckled without humor. I didn't feel calm. I just felt tired. He was quiet for a beat. "You know, it's okay if you stop bending over backward. She's an adult now. If she can't see what she's doing, maybe it's time she feels it." That stuck with me. Maybe it's time she feels it. I had always believed that love meant enduring, staying, waiting it out until they come back around. But maybe love also meant honesty, boundaries. Maybe the real problem wasn't her choices. It was my unwillingness to challenge them. I'd let her walk into that event thinking my presence was guaranteed, unconditional. And she used that security to sideline me. Maybe she didn't mean to hurt me. Maybe it was just convenience. But either way, she didn't think I'd react. She didn't think I'd leave. And when I did, when I tore that check and handed her the pieces, it wasn't just an act of protest. It was a message, not just to her, but to me. That night, I found the envelope where I'd written my speech and pulled it out. The pages were still crisp, the ink slightly smudged where I'd gripped the edges too tight. I read it aloud, just once, standing alone in my kitchen. It was good, better than I remembered. Honest, warm, full of little stories only I could tell. It had heart. It had me. And that's when it really hit me. This wasn't just about losing a speaking role. It was about losing space, losing voice. I had something to say, and no one had cared to hear it. But I heard it, and that would have to be enough for now. By Monday, the aftershocks had started. Not from her. Of course, she was radio silent. But the ripple had reached people who knew just enough to be dangerous. The first ping came from a distant aunt, who texted, "Hope everything's okay between you two. I heard you left early." That was the thing about families like mine. They never ask why. They ask what they heard, then compare it to what they think should have happened. I didn't reply. The second wave came later that afternoon when I was at work, sorting through spreadsheets I couldn't care less about. A colleague of mine, Sharon again, ever the town crier, forwarded me a local online newsletter link with a note. Look who got featured. It was a glowing write-up of the fundraiser, complete with quotes from Rick. Not her. Rick. And the article called him a guiding figure in her journey to becoming an advocate for the arts. I blinked at the screen, the bile rising slowly from somewhere deep. I had been quietly investing in her journey since she was 7, and now this man, who came in at halftime, was getting the credit because he had a tighter blazer and a glossier pitch. That article hit harder than I expected. I read it twice, each word dulling me further, like being hit over the head with a velvet-wrapped hammer. I kept wondering if she had sent it in herself, submitted the quotes, curated the narrative. And if she hadn't, why hadn't she corrected it? Why hadn't she told the writer, "Actually, my father was supposed to speak, but we made a late change. He was the reason I got into this work in the first place." She didn't say that because she didn't think to. Or worse, she didn't want to. And that left me spiraling. I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling tiles, remembering the first art kit I bought her when she was 10. She'd cried when she opened it. I remember how proud she was the first time her painting got hung in a student gallery. It was me who paid for those lessons, those supplies, those endless Saturday drop-offs. I kept thinking, did she forget? Or did she just reassign the credit because Rick fits better in the story she wants to tell now? I didn't call her. I didn't confront her. But I did what most of us do when we're angry but trying to seem composed. I let it leak. In conversations with mutual family, I stopped buffering my words. When someone asked how the fundraiser went, I said, "Well, I had a speech ready, but they decided someone else was more polished." I didn't name names. I didn't have to. Everyone knew who someone else was. That word, polished, kept echoing in my head like a bell I didn't ring. It wasn't just a critique of my delivery. It was a quiet insult to everything I am. Rick wore polished shoes. Rick had polished charm. But I had scraped knees from kneeling at science fairs. I had calluses from building easels she used once. I had receipts. But none of that shined under gallery lights, so it didn't count. Later that week, I finally got a text from her. Short. Blunt. We should probably talk. That was all it said. No apology. No acknowledgement of what happened. Just a sterile attempt at damage control. I waited 3 hours before I replied with, "Let me know when." She picked Thursday night. We met at a quiet coffee shop halfway between our homes, one we used to go to when she was in college. I arrived first, sat near the back, ordered nothing. She came in wearing a camel coat and boots, her hair tied back like she was heading to a board meeting. She looked tired, or maybe just careful. She slid into the seat across from me and offered a stiff smile. "Thanks for coming," she said. I nodded. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she exhaled. "Look, I didn't mean to hurt you." I wasn't trying to be cold. The event it was stressful. I needed everything to be perfect. I watched her as she spoke, her hands fluttering near her cup, but never picking it up. She was nervous. Or guilty. Or both. So Rick was perfect? I asked quietly. She flinched. No. He has a presence. He's confident in those settings. She hesitated. You're softer. More thoughtful. But you get flustered when you're nervous. I didn't want you to feel pressured. I laughed, but it wasn't kind. You didn't want me to feel pressured? So you pulled me minutes before the speech? That wasn't protection. That was erasure. She closed her eyes for a beat. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I should have handled it better." But there was no weight to it. No ownership. Just air. I leaned forward, my voice steady but sharp. "You didn't just replace me at the mic. You replaced me in the story. That post. That article. Rick being quoted like he raised you." She looked away. "I didn't write the article," she muttered. "But you didn't correct it either," I snapped. "You let people think he's the reason you became who you are? You let them forget me." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for a public war over this," she said. "You're the one who made it dramatic. You tore the check, Dad. You walked out." I stared at her, stunned by the deflection. "No. I handed you a mirror. If you don't like what you saw in it, that's not my fault." She blinked, her mouth parting slightly, then closed again. For a second, she looked 12 again, caught in something bigger than her. But then the adult mask slid back on. "I'm sorry if you felt replaced," she said. I laughed again, this time softer. "That's not an apology. That's a PR statement." I stood. "I'm not doing this to fight. I just needed you to know I'm done pretending it doesn't sting. I've spent years giving without asking for credit. But this time, I needed to be seen. And you didn't see me." She didn't try to stop me. Didn't follow me out. And I didn't look back. I didn't hear from her for over 2 weeks after the coffee shop. No calls. No texts. No breadcrumb messages disguised as just checking in. And for the first time in years, I didn't chase the silence. I didn't fill it with apologies I didn't owe or gestures meant to smooth things over. I let the stillness stretch. I let the distance sit between us like a drawbridge pulled up, and it surprised me how calm it felt. Not peaceful, exactly. There was too much grief tucked under the calm for that, but clear. I could finally hear myself think without drowning in the echoes of guilt or old obligations. I spent those days tending to the little things I'd ignored. Fixing the leaky sink, walking longer in the mornings, returning calls from friends I hadn't spoken to since before the fundraiser. It was like breathing different air, sharper, but mine. And yet, even with the silence, I knew the narrative hadn't stopped spinning. Family circles don't need new facts to keep old rumors alive. They just add water and stir. I got a message from my sister one night. Elaine, never one to hold her tongue. She's upset, the text read. No punctuation. No context. Just a nudge. I ignored it for 2 days before finally calling her back. What's she saying? I asked flatly. Elaine sighed. That you embarrassed her. That you're holding on to something that wasn't that deep. She says you let pride ruin the night. I leaned back in my chair, eyes closing. Did she mention the speech? The months I spent preparing? The check? Silence on the other end. No, Elaine admitted. But you know how she is. She's always been good at looking forward and bad at looking back. I almost laughed. Looking forward. That was always her strength. Building the next thing. Crafting the next success. But what do you call someone who looks forward by stepping over the people behind them? Elaine meant well, but she started to shift the tone. You're her father, she said. You're supposed to rise above it. She's still figuring things out. Maybe it wasn't personal. I was so tired of hearing that. Maybe it wasn't personal. Like that made it better. Like being overlooked on accident didn't still leave a bruise. I told her plainly. I didn't walk away because I wanted to hurt her. I walked away because I finally saw how little she thought I mattered when it wasn't convenient for her image. Elaine didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. She said she hoped we'd find our way back to each other. I told her that wasn't the goal anymore. The goal was clarity, boundaries, healing that didn't require performing pain for applause. But clarity, as I was learning, didn't come without a cost. I ran into Rick a few days later at the hardware store. Of all places. He was standing near the paint samples, looking exactly like a man who never had to mix his own colors. Pressed collar, clean hands, that ever-calm expression that made people trust him without knowing why. When he saw me, he gave that polite nod men give each other when they're not sure if they're about to talk or fight. I nodded back. We both stood still for a second. Then he walked over. Hey, he said. Wasn't expecting to see you here. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah, well, some of us fix our own homes. The jab landed, but he didn't bite. Just chuckled. Look, I'm not here to stir anything up, he said. I just wanted to say, I didn't know she had switched speakers until right before the event. She told me after. I studied his face. He looked sincere, or trained to seem sincere. Hard to tell. And yet, I said slowly, you still took the mic, gave the speech. Took the credit. He frowned. I didn't write that article, he said. I didn't ask for any of that. I tilted my head. But you didn't correct it either. He didn't answer right away. I care about her, he said finally. I try to support her. Sometimes that means stepping up. I stared at him, heart thudding, not with rage, but with the awful ache of confirmation. Support. That's what they call it when they rewrite history with a smile. Supporting her doesn't mean erasing me, I said. You walked into a role that wasn't yours, and instead of asking questions, you played the part. He nodded slowly. Maybe I did. Maybe I should have said no. I didn't know you'd be hurt by it. I turned to leave. Then you weren't paying attention. I didn't tell my daughter about the encounter. I didn't send a recap or try to use it as leverage. What was there to gain? Rick had spoken his piece. I'd spoken mine. The damage had already been done, and not just at the fundraiser. The real damage was in the pattern, in how easy it had become for her to place me on a shelf until I fit the decor. And maybe she didn't know she was doing it. But maybe that was the problem. What gets applauded gets repeated. And if no one calls it out, the pattern keeps spinning. A week after that, I got a handwritten letter in the mail. Not an envelope, just a folded sheet of paper tucked into my front door. It was from her. Short, barely a page. She wrote, I still think you overreacted. But I'm starting to understand why you did. I'm not ready to have another big conversation yet. But I miss you. I read it 3 times. And on the third read, I felt something crack, but not open. Just enough to sting. Because there it was again, not an apology, not a reckoning, just a breadcrumb, a tug at the heart, a test to see if I'd fall back in line. But I didn't reply. I folded the letter, slid it into the back of a drawer, and left it there. Because I knew this time couldn't be like the others. This time, I wouldn't rescue her from her own consequences. I'd done enough performing. I'd done enough pretending that being quiet was the same as being respected. It wasn't. And if she wanted to rebuild something real, she'd have to start by stepping off the stage and sitting with me. As equals. As people. Until then, the silence would stay. It's funny how a single moment, just a few quiet seconds of truth, can outlive every carefully planned word. I had spent weeks crafting that speech for her fundraiser, agonizing over each line, thinking my voice would echo through the room as some proud final stamp on her journey. But it wasn't my speech that lingered. It wasn't the carefully chosen story about her childhood drawing contests or the way she used to label her crayon boxes by mood. No, the only thing people remembered, if they remembered me at all, was the sound of that check tearing. I didn't plan for that to become the headline. I didn't walk into that gallery expecting to make a statement without opening my mouth. But I realized now that the real speech, the one that mattered, was made in silence. And sometimes silence thunders louder than applause. A month had passed. The distance between us hadn't narrowed, and I'd stopped checking my phone with that anxious hope I used to carry. There was a shift in me, not a bitter one, but a settled one. I had done enough, given enough, proved enough. And if my daughter couldn't see my value without the bright lights and curated moments, then maybe I needed to stop trying to perform for her approval. I started spending my weekends differently. I'd walk to the bookstore and let myself sit in the back with a novel and a coffee, not because anyone expected me to, but because it felt good to do something just for me. I said yes to dinners with friends I'd long neglected and even started painting again, badly, but freely. I stopped being a father trying to be included and started being a man reclaiming his time. One Saturday afternoon, I ran into Joy, an old friend of my daughter's from college who used to come by for Thanksgiving when her dorms closed. She saw me at the farmer's market, lit up, and came rushing over with that wide, honest smile she always had. "Mr. Daniels," she said, wrapping me in a quick hug. "It's so good to see you. I was just thinking about you the other day, at the fundraiser." I tensed, instinctively bracing for what she'd say next. "You were supposed to speak, right?" I was really looking forward to that. I blinked, surprised. "You knew that?" She nodded. "Of course. Your daughter mentioned it weeks before. Said you were practicing nonstop. But then Rick spoke, and I was like, huh?" She shrugged. "Not the same heart, you know? Felt kinda staged." Her words hit deeper than she realized. I thanked her, and after she left, I stood by the apples for a while, letting the world slow down. That moment meant more to me than any public redemption arc. It was a quiet validation from someone who had no reason to lie, no stake in the outcome. And it reminded me that sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted from a stage. Sometimes it shows up in the subtext, in the people who notice what should have happened and say something when no one else will. That interaction gave me something I hadn't had in weeks: clarity without pain. Still, there was a part of me that wanted one last exchange with my daughter, not to fix everything, but to put the final period on a sentence that had been dangling too long. I wasn't chasing reconciliation. I wasn't holding on to hope like a lifeline, but I wanted to say something out loud, not in anger, not in blame, just so I could walk forward knowing I had left nothing unsaid. So I invited her to meet for a walk, neutral territory, no coffee shops, no microphones, no audience. Just a father and a daughter, walking side by side in a park we used to visit when she was small. She agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and we met under gray skies that threatened rain but never delivered. For the first few minutes, we didn't talk. Just the sound of gravel beneath our shoes and birds somewhere overhead. Then she spoke first. "I read your speech," she said, eyes forward. "You left a copy in the folder I returned to you. I didn't read it until last week." I nodded. "Yeah. It was good," she added quietly. "Better than what Rick said, honestly." I didn't gloat. I didn't say I know. I just walked, breathing evenly. "Thank you," I said. Then I stopped walking, turning to face her. "I'm not mad anymore," I said. "But I'm different now." She looked confused. "Different how?" I swallowed. For years, I showed up, in ways that didn't always get noticed. And I did it because I love you. I still do. But I realized that I've been shrinking myself to fit into the moments you had room for me. And when you chose someone else for that speech, not because I wasn't there, but because I didn't look as polished, I saw the pattern. I saw how easily you rearranged the furniture of your life to fit your version of perfect. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. "I didn't mean to make you feel invisible," she whispered. "But you did," I replied. "And it's not the first time. I let it go before because I thought love meant enduring. But now I think love also means not letting yourself disappear." We stood in silence for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, almost like it hurt. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. "I'm not asking you to," I replied. "I'm just asking you to sit with it. And remember it next time you have a mic to pass." That was it. No hugs. No dramatic ending. Just two people standing in the truth. She walked me back to the lot, and before we parted, she said, "I'm sorry it took all this for me to see it." I gave a small smile. "I'm sorry I waited this long to say it." Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table, alone but not lonely. I pulled out the torn check stub still tucked in my drawer. I didn't tape it back together. I didn't throw it away either. I left it there, split down the middle, a symbol not of bitterness, but of boundaries. Of drawing a line between who I was and who I refused to be anymore. The lesson wasn't about the fundraiser or the speech. The lesson was the mic. You can hand it to someone else, but what they do with it tells you everything. And when someone passes over your voice because you don't fit their image, it's not your job to scream louder. It's your job to walk away knowing your silence was the loudest truth they'll ever hear. Have you ever been quietly replaced in someone else's life and expected to smile through it? This story hit a nerve for me, and maybe it did for you too. If you've ever had to draw a hard boundary with someone you love, drop a comment and tell me how you knew it was time. Let's talk about what it really takes to stop performing and start protecting your peace. And if this story stayed with you, like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real stories about family, fallout, and finding your voice. See you soon in the next story.